Now we will hear from Ron Greenstein, who will discuss the extent to which the legal definition of apartheid, based on the notion of racial domination, applies to the practices of the oppressing group in Israel, Palestine. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. First, the definition. Apartheid is a system of racial domination in which a dominant group exploits, oppresses, marginalizes, and excludes subordinate groups. And the specific form of these practices may vary from one place to another. They don't need to be identical to the South African case. What I would argue is that our focus should be on the actual practices of the state rather than on the way we define the specific relevant groups. The UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination talks about, or allows us to talk about, conditions of racial domination in which there are no races. You don't need to have racial groups in order to have racial domination and racial oppression. In other words, when we apply this definition to the case of Israel-Palestine, we identify two relevant groups, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. These groups are not racial in nature, but rather base their identity on ethnicity and religion, on a sense of common origins and cultural practices. But for our purposes here, it doesn't matter whether race in the biological or physical sense form a part of the system of domination. The crucial point is whether the state uses group membership in order to allocate social and political rights in a differentiated manner. And in Israel-Palestine, group membership is an official category that is imposed and monitored by the state. It's not a voluntary identity only. It's very difficult to move, not impossible, but very difficult to move from one group to the other, theoretically possible. And to be Jewish has nothing to do with religious observance. Rather, it means to be recognized by the state as a member of the Jewish community. This membership is codified in population registration data, which is kept by the Ministry of the Interior, and it carries with it certain rights and obligations having to do with immigration and residence and access to land, as well as military service. Israeli Jews are a group unified by law, sharing the same legal status wherever they reside. Palestinian Arabs, in contrast, are divided by the legal status into citizens, occupied residents, and refugees who have no right to return to any part of historical Palestine. No such restrictions apply to Jews. Those who are not citizens can acquire Israeli citizenship automatically upon relocating to the country. This distinction is used to expand citizenship beyond Israeli territory, potentially to all Jews, and to restrict citizenship within the territory. Palestinian residents of the occupied territories have no citizenship and cannot become Israeli citizens, and the same obviously applies to refugees. In other words, to put it more formal terms, citizenship is open to all non-resident members of the dominant group, wherever they are and regardless of their personal history and actual links to the territory. It's closed off to all non-resident members of the subordinate group, wherever they are and regardless of their personal history and actual links to the territory. Now, when we use terms like Israel, and that I think is quite fundamental, it's an ambiguous concept because it's not clear. It's not clear from the definition of this tribunal what exactly are referring to. Because Israel as a geographical entity is based on the permanent blurring of physical boundaries. The boundaries are permanently temporary. So we talk about, or people talking in legal terms, the 1967 occupation is supposed to be a temporary aberration. But in fact, it has lasted almost as long as historical apartheid in South Africa. And we have to realize that these boundaries are asymmetrical. They're not symmetrical. They are porous. They allow transfer in one direction, expansion of military forces and settlers into neighboring territories, but they are impermeable in another direction. They don't allow entry of Palestinians, those who are not already resident there, into the territory. Now, the Israeli regime combines different modes of rule. We have civilian authority with formal institutions of democracy, within the Green Line. We have military authority without any democratic pretensions beyond the Green Line. But this kind of distinction, again, is not permanent. In times of crisis, the military mode of rule tend to spill over into the Green Line to apply to Palestinian citizens. At all times, the civilian mode of rule tends to spill over the Green Line to apply to Jews residing in the occupied territories. So the distinction between what is Israel proper, what is the occupied territories, is blurred as a result and is constantly eroding to the point that it's difficult to know whether it's meaningful any longer. Israel has been defined, sort of self-definition of its leadership and supported by the majority of the population as a Jewish democratic state. But someone, I'm not sure who, defined it rather as a Jewish demographic state. Jewish demographic state means the demography, the fear that Jews may become a minority, is the prime concern behind the policies of all mainstream parties and forces, all state structures and policies. Since 1948, and in essence, even before 1948, are geared in consequence to meet the concern for a permanent Jewish majority exercising political domination in the state of Israel in whichever boundaries it finds itself. How all this is related to the notion of apartheid. One thing to understand, and it's poorly understood, is that although there was a formal distinction between white and black people in South Africa under apartheid, there were also a lot of cross-cutting affiliation, crossing beyond the color line. I'll just give two examples. First, religion. Christianity was a multi-racial religion, which allowed some kind of unity beyond racial boundaries. Not perfect unity, obviously, there were racial division within the church as well, but there was also a common basis as well for people to organize and to base their identity on. Languages were also multiracial in nature. Afrikaans in South Africa is a multiracial language. English is a multiracial language. So there were elements of identity that allowed people to go beyond the racial boundaries imposed by the states. In Israel, the situation is much more restrictive in that sense, because all the different bases of identity actually overlap: religion, nationality, ethnicity, language. They overlap in a sense that it's much easier to talk about dichotomous group here. Jews who are distinct by language, religion, nationality, ethnicity, and Palestinians who have different aspects of their identity on all these dimensions. Would like to mention just one group that is kind of breaking through this kind of imposed dichotomy, and these are Palestinian citizens of Israel. The thing about Palestinian citizens of Israel is that they are positioned legally between Jewish citizens and Palestinian non-citizens. There's no question that they are part of the Palestinian people in terms of their identity, consciousness, culture, and so on, but they are the only segment of the population that is fully bilingual, that are familiar and involved with all political and cultural realities, who have enough freedoms to organize, but not enough rights to align themselves with the oppressive status quo. It's a minority group. It's only about 15 to 20% of the Israeli population and about 15 to 20% of the Palestinian overall group, but they are crucial to any kind of strategy political change because precisely they break this dichotomy, the only group to break this dichotomy between the two groups. Final point, just to point to another important element of the similarity between and the difference between apartheid in South Africa and what I would call apartheid of a special type in Israel-Palestine. Under historical apartheid in South Africa, a major goal of the state was to ensure that black people performed their role as providers of labor, but without raising difficult social and political demands. The strategy used for that was forcible relocation on the one hand, but also externalization in a conceptual sense. They were physically present in white homes, factories, farms, and service industries, but they were absent conceptually, politically, legally, as rights-bearing citizens. They were expected to exercise their rights elsewhere. Those who were not functional for the white-dominated economy were prevented from moving into the urban areas or relocated if they were living there. Black people who worked in the cities were expected to commute between the places where they had jobs but no political rights, and places where they had rights but no jobs. And this system of migration opened up a contradiction between political and economic imperatives, which eventually played a role in the downfall of apartheid. In the Israeli case, in contrast, the economic imperative has always been to create employment for Jewish immigrants or potential immigrants. And Palestinian labor was never central to Jewish prosperity in Israel. And this has both negative and positive implications. The negative implication, or I'll focus on the negative implication, because as a result of this kind of externalization of Palestinians, and because they are not central to the economic prosperity of Jews, or the Jewish-dominated economy, they are dispensable. So it's much easier for the Israeli state to practice physical exclusion because there are no economic consequences for the prosperity of Jews in Israel. In South Africa, it was much more difficult because white prosperity depended on the presence of subordinate but physically present black in South Africa. And that has very important implications for strategies of political change, but that goes beyond our mandate.
Thank you, Ron. Does any member of the jury have a question for Ron? Thank you, Marie.
Thank you very much, Ron, for your excellent presentation. I would like to ask a question about passports. I think I continue to get very shocked when a Palestinian says to me, I do not have a passport. Can you explain to me if any Palestinians have passports, if Palestinians in Israel have passports? How does that system work? And can you please tell me a little bit more about the checkpoints and the pass systems and our Palestinians, what way that paper trail works, please?
Okay, I'll just answer on the part that I feel more confident. There are other people who are better qualified to talk about the system of checkpoints and so on, and I think they are scheduled to speak later on. We have to realize that there are different types of Palestinians under Israeli control. Different types, not in the sense they are different types of human beings, but they have different legal status. So those who are citizens of Israel, which are about 15 to 20% of the total Israeli population and 15 and 20 to 20% of the total Palestinian population in all parts of the world, are Israeli citizens. So they have passport, they are subject to all kinds of formal and informal discrimination, but they are citizens. Palestinians who live in the occupied territories usually either don't have any citizenship or can be Jordanian citizens if they had lived under Jordanian rule before 1967. Many of them have lost that. Palestinian in Gaza, most of them don't have any citizenship. So I guess for purposes of travel, they would have to get travel documents which are not passports to allow them to go from one place to another. But that's important to keep in mind, this distinction between the different legal categories.
Ron, I will pose the last question to you. We've talked in this discussion so far and in your paper about oppressor, racial group, dominant group, subordinate group. Could you tell me what the correct language is for that dominant oppressor group that we're talking about? First part of the question. Then secondly, are those Palestinian Israeli citizens that you mentioned, are they subject to serve the law with respect to apartheid and also persecution?
Okay, what's the correct terminology? The answer is that it depends on the purposes for which you use terminology. So I would say as far as I know, most Israeli Jews, most Palestinian Arabs do not define themselves in racial terms. they regard themselves as ethno-national groups or ethno-religious groups. That I would say is the correct term, not on some
So in
theoretical-
everyday language, what's that?
In everyday language means that they define themselves as a specific group that shares common history and some kind of common culture and
I
identity.
understand that's the definition, but if I were a journalist and I'm trying to write a story and I want to refer to the oppressor racial group in Israel, Palestine, how do I describe
I would
that?
refer to it as a sort of, in terms of the name, as Israeli Jews. And I would say that that's the nominal group based on the ethnic/national identity. I wouldn't use the racial terminology. But I want also to add that in terms of UN conventions, you can have racial domination even when the domination is exercised on ethnic or religious or national grounds. So you don't need to impose a racial straitjacket, a conceptual straitjacket on the situation to prove that they are racial groups. What's important that they are treated differentially in terms of their own identity, in terms of state practices.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.